Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're digging into something that seems to pop up every single spring.
Ah, yes. That recurring idea.
Exactly. This claim that Easter, the Christian holiday, actually comes from worshiping the ancient Mesopotamian goddess Ishtar.
Right. It's quite persistent online, isn't it?
It really is. And you, listening, you might have seen it, maybe read an article, heard someone mention it. So our mission today is to really, get into the weeds with this, look at the actual evidence.
Yeah, separate the fact from the fiction, potentially.
We'll be looking at historical records, linguistics, even theological angles.
It's important, I think, to understand where these deep traditions actually come from.
Definitely. Okay, let's get started. Where do we begin? Maybe the historical context for Easter itself.
Sounds good. So fundamentally, Easter is about commemorating the resurrection of Jesus Christ.
Which the Gospels place around, 30 to 33 CE?
Exactly. Matthew 28, for instance, gives that account of the empty tomb, the message, he is risen.
And critically, this wasn't happening in a vacuum. It was tied directly to the Jewish Passover, Pesach.
Absolutely fundamental. John's gospel makes it clear Jesus' crucifixion happened during Passover time.
So that immediately puts Easter's origins in that Judeo-Christian world.
Precisely. And then you have the Council of Nicaea later on in 325 CE.
Right. They played a big role in sorting out date, didn't they?
They did. They formalized it as the first Sunday after the first full moon following the spring equinox.
Okay.
And the key point there is why they chose that timing. It was explicitly to keep it linked to the timing of Passover.
Not to sync up with, say, some existing pagan spring festival.
No, not at all. The focus was maintaining that Passover connection.
Okay, that seems pretty clear-cut from the early historical decisions.
Yeah.
And what about early Christian writings? Do they back this up?
They really do.
Yeah.
Look at the letters from the apostles. Paul, in 1 Corinthians, for example, he writes, Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. That kind of imagery, that direct link to Passover themes, it's right there very early on.
So the core concepts were already deeply tied to Jewish tradition.
Absolutely. And crucially, if you search through all the primary sources from those first few centuries, the first 4 centuries CE, there's just no mention anywhere linking the developing Easter traditions to Ishtar or any Babylonian rituals. It's just absent.
Huh. So historically, the trail seems cold for an Ishtar connection.
Very cold.
Okay, let's pivot then. What about the linguistic argument? Because Easter and Ishtar, they do sound, a bit similar.
They do, and that phonetic similarity is really the linchpin of the claim. But, it's generally considered a linguistic fallacy, a sort of false friend.
How so?
Well, first, the pronunciation Ishtar, or Ishtar in Akkadian, is more like Ishpar. That ish sound is quite different from the E in Easter.
Okay, Ishtar versus Esther, different vowel sounds.
Right, and also the name Easter is pretty specific geographically. It's mainly English and German.
Where does it come from?
It comes from Old English, the word Eostre.
Eostre. And that connects to the Venerable Bede, right? The monk writing in the 8th century.
Exactly. Around 730 CE, Bede wrote his work, The Reckoning of Time. In it, he mentions a month called Eostre.
Eosterman.
Yeah, and he suggests it might be named after a local Germanic goddess, Eostre. He sort of implies maybe she was linked to spring festivals.
Okay, so Bede connects the month name to a possible goddess Eostre.
Yes, and this is a really big, but Bede's writing is literally the only historical reference we have to Eostre. Anywhere.
Just one mention, that's it.
That's it. We have no surviving myths about her. No prayers, no archaeological evidence pointing to widespread worship in those areas. She's a ghost, essentially, based on one line by Bede.
Wow. Okay, so even the Eostre connection is pretty thin, based only on Bede's speculation about a month name.
It is, and even if we grant Eostre existed and was significant locally, linguistically, connecting her name to Ishtar is another big leap.
Why is
Well, the leading theory is that Eostre, if the name refers to a goddess, probably comes from a Proto-Indo-European root, hruz, which means dawn or to shine.
Okay, linked to dawn, spring, light. That makes sense.
Right. It connects to words for east and dawn in many related languages. But that root has no known connection to the Akkadian name Ishtar, which comes from a completely different language family. Semitic.
So different linguistic origins entirely. Eostre from Indo-European roots, Ishtar from Semitic.
Exactly. The sound similarity is almost certainly coincidental.
And isn't it true that most languages don't even use a word like Easter anyway?
That's another huge point. The vast majority of languages use some variation of Pascha.
Like Spanish Pascua, French Pâques?
Italian Pasqua, Greek Pascha. They all come directly from Pascha, the Greek and Latin word for Passover, derived from the Hebrew Pesach.
So if the celebration was truly an import named after Ishtar or even Eostre, why would almost everyone else call it by a name meaning Passover?
It just doesn't line up. The widespread use of Pascha strongly points back to the Judeo-Christian origins linked to Passover.
Okay, the linguistic case seems, well, shaky at best. Let's talk about Ishtar herself then. What was she actually the goddess of? Does her character fit Easter themes at all?
Not really, no. Ishtar, or Inanna as she was known in Sumerian, was a major Mesopotamian deity. Her main domains were quite intense: war, sexual love, and political power.
War, sex, and power.
She was complex, powerful, sometimes seen as capricious, but her core themes don't really align with resurrection, redemption, rebirth in the Christian sense.
And her symbols. Were they eggs and bunnies?
Definitely not. Her main symbols were the lion, representing her power and connection to royalty, and the eight-pointed star, representing Venus, the planet she was associated with. We see these in texts like the Epic of Gilgamesh.
Lions and stars. A far cry from Easter baskets.
Very different imagery, yes.
But what about the story of her going to the underworld? Some people draw a parallel there with Jesus' death and resurrection. 3 days, descent, return.
Right. That myth, often called Inanna's descent to the netherworld, is frequently brought up. And yes, superficially, there's a death and return element. She goes down, she's killed, she eventually comes back.
So there's the parallel.
Well, only on the surface. When you look at the why and the how, it's completely different.
Yeah.
Ishtar goes down, essentially trying to usurp her sister's power in the underworld. It's a power grab.
Okay, so motivation is different.
Hugely different. And her return isn't a victory over death for others. She only gets out by condemning someone else, her own consort, Dumuzi, to take her place.
Ouch, not exactly a selfless act.
Not at all. Compare that to the Christian narrative. Jesus' voluntary sacrifice out of love for humanity, his resurrection as a victory over sin and death for everyone who believes. The meaning couldn't be more different.
Right. One's about gaining power, the other about giving life. And what about timing? Did Ishtar have festivals around springtime?
No. Her major festivals, particularly those connected with the mourning and return of Tammuz, Dumuzi, were typically celebrated later, in the heat of summer, around June or July.
So, wrong time of year compared to Easter's spring timing.
Correct. And again, geographically, her cult centers were in Mesopotamia. There's no evidence her worship spread to the Anglo-Saxon or Germanic regions where the name Easter later emerged.
Okay, so disconnected thematically, symbolically, temporally, and geographically.
Pretty much, yes.
What about the eggs and bunnies then? If they're not from Ishtar, where do they come from? Because they're obviously strongly associated with Easter now.
They are, but the claim they're ancient fertility symbols directly from Ishtar's cult just doesn't hold up. We've seen her symbols were lions and stars.
Right.
The Easter egg likely has roots in later European Christian practices. Maybe connected to Lent, eggs were forbidden, so people decorated them to eat on Easter Sunday.
Ah, like a post-Lent treat.
Possibly. Or maybe symbolizing the empty tomb or new life. The red-dyed eggs in Orthodox tradition symbolize Christ's blood. These customs developed within Christianity over centuries.
And the bunny, the Easter bunny.
That seems to be even later, and specifically German. There's folklore from the 1600s about the Osterhase, literally Easter hare.
A hare that laid eggs?
Yeah, a mythical hare that supposedly laid colorful eggs for well-behaved children. German immigrants brought this tradition to America in the 1700s, and it evolved into the Easter bunny we know.
So German folklore from the 17th century, not ancient Babylon.
Exactly. Now, could the hare have had older, maybe pagan associations with spring or fertility in general Germanic folklore? Sure, that's possible. But these specific traditions, the decorated eggs, the egg-laying hare, were adopted and sort of baptized into the Christian celebration much, much later. They lost whatever prior pagan meaning they might have had and certainly have no documented link back to Ishtar.
Okay, that makes sense. Later customs getting absorbed and repurposed.
It happens all the time in cultural and religious history. But again, no primary source connects eggs or bunnies to Ishtar.
So we've looked at history, language, Ishtar herself, the symbols. The Ishtar connection seems to be evaporating. Where on earth did this idea even start? If it's not in the ancient sources, Who came up with it?
Now that is where it gets really interesting.
Mm.
The popularization of this specific Easter-Ishtar link largely traces back to one person.
Who was it?
A Scottish Free Church minister named Alexander Hislop. In the mid-19th century, 1853 I think it was, he published a pamphlet that later became a book called The Two Babylons.
The Two Babylons. Okay,
Yeah.
What was his argument?
Well, Hislop had a very strong anti-Catholic agenda. His whole thesis was that the Roman Catholic Church was essentially pagan Babylonian mystery religion disguised in Christian clothes.
Wow, okay. That's a bold claim.
Very. And as part of this argument, he claimed that many Christian holidays and practices were just rebranded paganism. He specifically asserted that Easter was the festival of the Babylonian goddess Astarte.
Astarte, not Ishtar.
He seemed to conflate Ishtar and Astarte, who was a related but distinct Northwest Semitic goddess. He used the names somewhat interchangeably and claimed Easter was derived from her name and worship.
Based on what evidence?
That's the problem. Hislop's work is widely criticized by scholars for its lack of actual evidence. He relied heavily on speculation, phonetic similarities taken out of context, like the Easter, Ishtar, Astarte sound-alike idea, and drew really tenuous connections.
Like what?
Like arguing that Druids in Britain were somehow practicing Babylonian religion, which is historically baseless. His methodology was really about finding anything that sounded or looked vaguely similar across cultures and centuries and declaring it proof of a Babylonian conspiracy within Catholicism.
So it wasn't rigorous historical or linguistic research. It was driven by his theological arguments against Catholicism.
Precisely. It was polemic, not scholarship. He ignored linguistic history, ignored the lack of primary sources connecting these things, all to push his anti-Catholic narrative.
And this 19th century pamphlet is the main source for the Easter-Ishtar claim we still hear today.
It's certainly the most influential popularizer of it. While his work has been thoroughly debunked by historians and linguists for over a century, the core idea, Easter equals pagan Ishtar, got detached from its original anti-Catholic context and just sort of took on a life of its own.
Huh. So it gets picked up by modern skeptics, maybe neo-pagans, who might not even know its origins and Hislop's specific agenda.
Exactly. It's become a piece of modern folklore, really, repeated often enough that people assume it must be true, despite the lack of academic support. It's a fascinating case study in how misinformation can persist.
It really is. And thinking about it logically, the claim itself seems to have some holes, doesn't it?
What do you mean?
Well, if Easter was just a rebranded Ishtar festival, wouldn't we expect to find, I don't know, some trace of her worship in Anglo-Saxon England where the name Easter came from? Or early Christians mentioning, even criticizing, this supposed pagan connection?
That's an excellent point. You'd expect some historical footprint, but there isn't one. No Ishtar cults in Britain or Germany. Yep. No early Christian writers saying, hey, let's stop celebrating this Babylonian thing on the resurrection day.
Right.
And why would most of the world adopt the name Pascha directly from Passover if the holiday's true origin was Mesopotamian? It doesn't add up. It really doesn't. And think about the early Christians themselves. They were often persecuted. They strongly rejected idolatry.
Yeah.
You see that in Acts, for instance, avoiding pollution of idols.
Yeah.
The idea that they would then consciously adopt a major pagan goddess's festival, slap Jesus' name on it, and make it the centerpiece of their faith seems, well, incredibly unlikely. Contradictory, even.
And what about Constantine? Didn't he sort of force pagan elements onto Christianity? People sometimes bring him up.
That's another common misconception. Constantine's Edict of Milan in 313 simply legalized Christianity, didn't make it the state religion, or merge it with paganism. And the Council of Nicaea in 325, which he convened, was about standardizing the date of Easter to unify the church.
Based on the Passover connection we already talked about.
Exactly. It wasn't about importing paganism. It was an internal Christian matter about calculation and unity. The meaning of the celebration wasn't changed.
Okay. So pushing aside the Ishtar myth, what is the foundation of Easter, then, from that core Judeo-Christian perspective? What makes it central?
Well, it's grounded entirely in the New Testament accounts of Jesus' resurrection. Christians see this as the ultimate fulfillment of Old Testament prophecies, like Isaiah 53 talking about the suffering servant rising again.
It's more than just remembering a historical event.
Oh, absolutely. The resurrection is the absolute bedrock of Christian belief. Paul says it clearly in 1 Corinthians 15. If Christ hasn't been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith.
So everything hinges on it.
Everything. It's seen as God's ultimate victory over sin and death, the proof of Jesus' divinity, and the promise of eternal life for believers. It's the core of the gospel message.
And that deep connection to Passover isn't just about timing, it's thematic too.
Immensely thematic. Just like the original Passover lamb's blood saved the Israelites in Egypt, Christians see Jesus as the ultimate Passover lamb whose sacrifice redeems humanity. That symbolism is woven throughout the New Testament and early Christian understanding.
And they were celebrating this long before any supposed pagan influences could have crept in.
Definitely. We see in the book of Acts, for example, that the early church met weekly on the Lord's Day, which was Sunday, specifically to commemorate the resurrection. This practice started basically immediately, centuries before B's wrote about Eostre, let alone any connection to Ishtar.
So bringing this all together then, after this deep dive, what's the main takeaway on the Easter-Ishtar connection?
The takeaway is pretty decisive, I think. The claim that Easter originates with Ishtar is essentially a modern myth. It has no real basis in historical fact, linguistic evidence, or theological understanding.
It stems from that 19th century anti-Catholic argument by Hislop, and it's persisted despite being debunked.
Exactly. It's misinformation that's unfortunately become quite widespread.
And the actual roots of Easter are firmly planted in Jewish Passover traditions and the Christian belief in the resurrection of Jesus.
Unquestionably. The historical trail, the linguistic evidence from most languages, Pascha, the theological meaning, and the practices of the early church all point consistently in that direction. The Ishtar link is simply not supported by the evidence we have.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? How easily stories like this can take root and spread, even when they lack a solid foundation.
It absolutely does. It underscores the importance of, looking critically at sources, asking where claims come from, especially when they concern deeply held traditions or historical narratives.
Yeah, always worth digging a little deeper.
Definitely. And perhaps for our listeners, this conversation sparks a thought about why we find these kinds of syncretic narratives appealing sometimes. Why do we look for hidden pagan origins? What does that say about how we view history and religion? Something to ponder.